Enjoying some edibles? Oh, I'm live. That's loud. Good afternoon. I'm Eric Matisik. I'm one of the co-founders of Denver Startup Week and organizers of this event, so we're honored that you're all here. This is going to be one of our best discussions yet. And so for those of you who've never been in this room before, this is our base camp launched by Chase. This is kind of the epicenter of all things Denver Startup Week, and we couldn't be more excited about our partnership with Chase Business. We just had the president of the Chase Business Group here this morning that through their investment, they've done 9 other startup weeks in other cities, and each one of them, including Dallas where he was last, they're like, you got to get to Denver. And he said this morning when he got here, saw the energy, the scale of the event, met a bunch of our entrepreneurs and people. He's like, Denver's doing it so differently, so much more unique, and the kind of the give first hustle is alive and well. There's no way this could be possible without our partners. We have some incredible title sponsors. WeWork, Chase for Business, Aging 2.0, Downtown Denver Partnership, and SendGrid. But today they are. I got 4 for 5. Who am I missing, Kate? Comcast for SendGrid. We swapped them out. Let's give a round of applause for Comcast. All right, but we couldn't do this. This is a 100% free event. It is by far the largest free event of its kind in the world, and to maintain its ability to be free, we have some incredible partners and sponsors. So this discussion I've been most excited for all week because not only do I know these 3 leaders exceptionally well, this discussion around going global, international leadership in the innovation economy is probably not a discussion we would have had in Denver 4 years ago, let alone even the last couple years of Startup Week, because the emergence, 1, of the scale of the event, but 2, the inclusion of those who are doing global business in Denver is a new thing. Having the likes of Zayo and ViaWest and Liberty and Aero and Ball Corp and Coors and Molson Coors, and bringing the dialogue of innovation and around international expansion, it couldn't be more exciting and more timely. So here today, I would love to introduce some of our partners on this panel. The whole cavalcade is out on the street. You guys are really important. Andrew Crouch is the new president and COO for Zayo Group. Zayo has been an incredible contributor, not only to Startup Week, but the community abroad. Over their tenure, through their leadership, they've been able to acquire over 40 companies in the space, took their company public a couple years ago in the largest IPO in the digital technology economy in the last 15 years. And Andrew is their new president and CEO coming over from Level 3. And really excited for you all to get to know him. He's just not only a spirit for what's happening at Zayo, but more importantly here in our community. Yes. To Andrew's left is Nancy Phillips. For those of you who've been around, this is a familiar face of Startup Week. Yesterday with Brad Feld, when we were kind of doing his AMA, actually, I'd given her the credit that Denver Startup Week probably wouldn't exist without her leadership. With Startup Colorado, we were driving down in a car, and I remember the discussion specifically, Nancy being like, wow, that Boulder Startup Week thing is so cool. A group of folks should do that in Denver. And she said it to the wrong person, because next thing you know, Tammy Dorr and Ben Data and all of us got together, and the event was born. And so thank you for that great idea. And then Bruce Dines is the Vice President of Innovation at Liberty Global Ventures. For any of those who know Liberty, they're part of the Liberty family of companies affiliated with John Malone's leadership here in Colorado, led by Mike Freeze. And really excited to chat with him because I think not a lot of people know that Techstars was started here in Colorado, but the Techstars Accelerator in Europe in and around media and innovation was really his leadership, and not only leading it from Colorado, but creating that connection between London and the home base here in Colorado. So just really excited about the discussion, and get your questions ready. We'll do about 30 minutes of discussion, and then we'll open up to Q&A at the end, and welcome to the panel. So to start off, I think it'd be good just to have each of them give some context around their global operations. Each of these leaders has really unique operations outside of Colorado, and I think it would be start just a quick intro, and then just as it relates to each of your companies, what you're doing outside of Denver and kind of the global scale of the business. Bruce?
Thanks, Eric. Is this working?
You're live.
All right, I'm live. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Liberty Global, think of us as Comcast overseas. We're actually by homes passed, the largest cable operator in the world. We operate in 13 countries in Western and Central Europe, and then we have a Latin American division called Lilac, which is now publicly known that it will be spun out as a separate entity here later on this year. So we have a corporate venture practice that really is focused on innovation. And we look at innovation, very simply, which is we can drive innovation by finding external solutions, platforms, and technologies and bring them into the company to help further our own strategies. And we can also drive innovation internally through various programs, which I can talk to at some later point.
Andrew?
Thank you, Eric. Good afternoon, everybody. Like you said earlier, Zayo Group has been on quite a tear over the last decade for 10 years. Started here as a startup up in Boulder and has grown globally to now $2.5 billion of annualized revenues around the world, employing 4,000 staff. Principally, we started here in the States, but have since expanded with acquisition into Canada, over into Western Europe, acquiring a number of companies to get both inner-city fiber and infrastructure, and also deep metro footprints of fiber in the UK and France. And as of late, we're starting to expand our services more broadly into Asia, extending what we call our Global Reach program to follow our customers to the key bandwidth demand pools around the big hubs of Asia, so think Tokyo, Sydney, Hong Kong, etc. So that's what we're up to, busy expanding more broadly from Denver, but here's where it all started.
Nancy?
Do I have that on? Hello? Hello?
She live back there. You can't allow Nancy not to have a microphone. Trade you.
All right. Yeah, there we go. I'm not going to take credit for Startup Denver. There was an awful lot of people, and the fact is that entrepreneurship lives everywhere, so why not? So ViaWest, we are a Colorado-born company. We started it back in 1999, have just gone through an extraordinarily transformational merger that's basically doubled the size of the company, and today we have 20 domestic and international sites. We have about 12,000 route miles, 40 data centers, 13 cloud pods. So from a digital infrastructure perspective, we've simply been on a tear ourselves, continuing to work with not only the communities that we reside in, but we've seen our company grow from a national and international basis. And I think that's really been driven by the fact that there are no borders. Our customers are pushing us on a global basis, and so we need to serve them where they're at. A great example is we obviously grew domestically. We entered the Canadian market about 3 years ago. We've expanded into Europe. We just completed a landing zone in our Oregon data center that has now our new cross-Pacific fiber cable is basically extended us into Asia Pac with the fastest and largest pipe into mainland China. We also just were awarded the Hawaii Key landing zone as well. That takes us into New Zealand and Australia and most importantly Hawaii. So we've been busy driving our network infrastructure out so that we can continue to serve and support what is primarily a domestic base with global needs. So that's what we've been doing on the global stage.
Well, let's jump right into it. I'd love to start with Andrew. You've had a career spanning the world, throughout your tenure, and whether it was leading Level 3 or now leading Zayo. When you really think about innovation and the need to consistently be pushing forward to drive activity within Zayo, what are some of the differences you see between what we do here in Denver or even broader in the U.S. versus EMEA or Africa or South Africa or some of the places that you've operated?
You know what? Differences range considerably depending on country and continents that you're talking about. As you know, I started my career in the UK, came to Denver, was here for a decade, then went back to London for a couple of years, and then came back to Denver, brought my family back, and we'll be here for a long time. One of the fundamental reasons why we wanted to come back here, other than the attraction of Zayo, was certainly in this continent, I certainly feel that there's a bigger drive and a faster pace and a greater impetus around wanting to take risks and rewarding people for genuinely creating value at fast pace. Some of the other countries, and I won't name any in particular, back in EMEA in Europe, are a lot more process orientated, a lot more risk averse, and the pace isn't what I see and find here, and I find that greatly attractive. That said, though, if I think a little bit more broadly around the world, I think of some of the emerging and growing countries and continents, so India as an example, whereby the pace at which they innovated on the communications infrastructure line, they kind of skipped a generation. They skipped a generation of landline and laying all those fiber optics to everybody's house, and leapt all the way through and invested in wireless. Now, every wireless bit needs to find its way to fiber eventually, so that comes back to aggregation points. But they were highly innovative in taking advantage of that technology leap to skip out a generation almost. On a platform basis, innovations that I've seen that have been quite startling. I'll go to Kenya in Africa. They are the world's leading online banking leadership around the globe. Pretty amazing to think they kind of skipped out the retail banking spot because they chose to invest in the software, the platform, and make a complete leap all the way to online banking environment. So what I've seen here, I like the pace, and I would encourage us to think a generation ahead rather than a quarter or a year ahead. And those things have stood out for me when I've looked at different countries and how they've innovated.
Nancy, as ViaWest has grown, being both born here in Colorado, but most recently through your first acquisition and some of the recent work. At one chapter of the business, you were owned by Shaw Communications and really had that Canadian spirit. Were there differences in the innovation cycles as through some of the ownership and exposure in Canada? And then as you've started to dabble in Asia with these new expansions, what are some things you're seeing around the innovation process across cultures?
Well, it helped that I was Canadian, so I spoke the language, made it really easy. I actually had somebody say, well, of course they spent $1.2 billion because you're Canadian. And I said, yes,
They're
that's
nice.
exactly the way it should be. But, going into Canada, clearly as you're thinking of global expansion, Canada is probably one of the easier putts just from a language perspective, and certainly there's a phenomenal amount of trade that goes between the companies, and we did a ton in the oil industry as an example. That was a bit of a downturn, unfortunately, but saw a lot of companies that had corporate offices between both Canada and the U.S., and so it was a natural next step for us just based on the sector of customers that we worked with, and we've seen a real extension there. Some of the differences, though, clearly, and no different than as we look in Europe, is data sovereignty. Data sovereignty is an extraordinarily important issue in the Canadian market, and something as we continue to extend infrastructure is much about how do we protect the data of customers in the Canadian market as well as in the U.S. markets. So security and privacy are very important issues as you're thinking about these things. I had a very unique situation. Literally, Shaw Communications bought ViaWest and maintained us as an independent, wholly owned subsidiary. So we had sort of the best of both worlds, which was that we were owned by this very large public angel investor that allowed us to continue to do what we had done and how we built the organization. That is very, very rare, and I don't take it for granted. That it was in a phenomenal 3 years that they just allowed us the free way to go and build the organization, continue to expand it, extend it into Canada, but they were very supportive in terms of our investment thesis to continue to grow where we see constant double-digit growth in our sector. I mean, you need to put your foot on the pedal in these. And so I would say we were almost like a small business within this large entity, and so it was the epitome of sort of entrepreneurship. We were able to continue to apply our entrepreneurial ways and move fleetly within a very large, I mean, it was a 14,000 multi-billion dollar company, yet we continue to remain very fleet, agile, and able to adapt, which in the digital infrastructure space, you know, you'll be wiped out if you don't continue to adapt and change to your customer needs. So I think it was a very unique situation, not typical, but certainly one that was extraordinarily beneficial for us to get to this point.
So Nancy, it sounds like from in that context that having the right partner and picking the right partner around some of those activities was really beneficial.
Yes, I've been extraordinarily blessed. I, raised private equity my entire life in the duration of ViaWest because it's a capital-intensive business, and the benefits I've had of the intersecting people. And when you are out raising money, it is as much about looking in the eyes. These need to be long-term partnership strategies. It's not about just, hey, who's going to offer the money? Who are you going to be able to work with, and do they have a common vision of where you can take the company? Otherwise, you'll lose the spirit and vision that you bring to the table that is really what the private equity groups are looking for. They are absolutely dependent on the operators to execute on the plan, and you have to have symmetry in that. So I don't take it for granted. I've been extraordinarily fortunate in terms of my private equity partners, my strategics, and that's something you have to work hard at and have confidence that you can obviously achieve that.
Bruce, I think it's probably a perfect segue into the context of innovation, both internal and external. And so obviously you guys are headquartered here, run the largest cable network in the world, predominantly in Europe. You've been able to partner and work with great community groups like Techstars to drive some of the innovation incrementally. What's your internal processes or your external processes, and how does some of those differ? And what's the innovation connectivity to operations in Europe from here?
Yeah, great questions. So we just do a very simple division between external and internal communications. The external piece, or external innovation, the external piece is really around our corporate venture initiatives. We're really tasked with going out and looking 3-4 years out, which is really about, I think, the limit of anybody's ability to prognosticate, and find technologies and solutions that we think are moving to where the market will be as opposed to the current market. So that creates an unbelievable tension between what I call the speed of venture and the speed of cable, and also just the speed of large corporations. We've been around for a long time, and a lot of our executives are, as you can imagine, older than the age of 40, and they don't really know, they've never really brought up in the concept of agile and lean. So there's a combination of things that are occurring relative to external and internal. Externally, obviously, we're making those investments. We're introducing these companies into the corporation. We launched our accelerator in an effort not just to make more investments, but really to understand the emerging landscape of software in particular, because the Techstars startup community is heavily biased towards software. So within 3 months, we had 900 applications for our accelerator for 10 spots from 48 countries. And that gave us a very good and very rapid view into how the landscape of these software technologies are emerging. That was very beneficial to us. And then internally, we have a process that we branded called Spark. We market it heavily. We have an internal idea generation engine that's accessible to all 48,000 of our employees. And we use an enterprise-wide innovation platform to drive ideation and drive campaigns in directions that we think they can add the most value. A few years ago, we ran a campaign around carbon footprint reduction and around energy savings. More recently, we ran a campaign around cost reduction, particularly OpEx cost reduction. This fall, we're going to run a campaign around, it's called CapEx Hunt, looking for ways that we can reduce capital. And then the fourth leg of our innovation platform, and sort of the second leg of our internal innovation platform, is a program called Matchbox, which is a 6-week curriculum designed to teach people agile and lean methodologies. And we roll that program through various divisions in the company, and working really to shift the culture to one that's more lean and more agile.
You guys are doing a lot. That's really impressive, and I think it's. I love the connectivity between kind of the next generation of workforce and the tools being able to equip some of the existing workforce around learning some of these new methodologies to be creative. Andrew, Zayo has set this audacious goal around diversity and inclusion to make sure that your workforce is 40%, kind of in the box as it relates to diversity and inclusion metrics. Anytime you talk to Dan, talent, the right humans, regardless of where they come from, is critical, and I think it's echoed across all three of you on the stage. When you think about innovation and you think about some of the cultural context, one, how can we stay in front of the talent to make sure that we're getting the best ideas? And two, as you're building kind of global and innovation teams, how are you putting them together to both create the inclusiveness that yields it, but also balancing cultural barriers to be able to move fast?
Yeah, I'll take the second one first, which is how do we organize to really encourage that entrepreneurial spirit and innovation? And I feel pretty confident in saying either we're unique or there's very few of us that actually organize our talent pools the way that Zayo does. All of the companies that I've worked for in my industry tend to organize on a functional basis, either nationally or globally. Zayo is very different. We've chosen to organize at a group level, essentially with 4 operating companies beneath. And we have leaders of each of those 4, which can be Zcolo as an example, or our fiber solutions business. Leaders of each of those 4 actually own and operate the businesses end to end. So they're empowered and are gifted with the capital to drive the market and get the best return, and their compensation is highly tied to equity IRR. Now, under the hood of those business units, they own all the functions directly, including their attorneys, including their CFO. So it's literally like running a business, and it's extremely flat. We do not have a lot of layers of management that get in the way of processing decisions and slowing things down. On the diversity point, very true. We from top to bottom, we got some more work to do in the middle. Certainly on gender diversity, we have 4 of our 9 board members are female. Pushing 50% of our employee base in Colorado is female too. And we continue to, thank you. And we continue to push all forms of diversity, but inclusive of that is diversity thinking. And one of our primary aspects of bringing new thoughts and new ideas into the new world that you've got to innovate on fast is we have a goal to basically augment our staff and our workforce through internships and graduate intakes through the local educational facilities here. So think DU and CU. Bring them in at both from a marketing school perspective, a technology and engineering. So that's how we want to bring our staff in and develop them and bring the new world millennial thinking in and make sure that us that are over 40s, highly compensated, if not, more than offset with our points of view with a lot of millennials that hang around us that give us that fresh thinking. So that's how we organize, and that's our kind of our view on human capital. And we do that globally, which back to your earlier point, how do you make that happen? We haven't regionalized our business. We've had people run those segments globally. And that was a recent twist that we organized the company around just at the beginning of the year. It's starting to settle in, but you can see it's forcing that global thinking to follow our customers across that borderless market that we're all trying to serve.
Nancy, I'd love for you to add a little on that too, and in kind of 2 vectors. Number one, as it relates to the lens of ViaWest, but also you're the incoming board chair for NCWIT. For those who don't know, it's the National Center for Women in Technology. It's led by incredible firms like Zayo and ViaWest and Apple and Google and eBay and you name it. Really trying to expand opportunities for women across IT in the world. I would love your perspective around innovation and how the work you're doing both internally and externally at ViaWest impacts the innovation cycles, both inside of ViaWest like regionally, but also the global context of what's happening in CWIT to drive that.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I applaud what Dan and team are doing at Zayo, and the reality is I know Dan Caruso, and he's a smart businessman. And so diversity is actually far more about, if you want to build the most competitive company you can on a global stage, diversity needs to be an essential part of your strategy. And if it isn't at the core, you will not. The empirical data is there to support. Companies perform better when they present diverse teams, whether that's at the most senior ranks of your board all the way through your executive teams, and potentially most importantly in innovative positions. So if the teams that you form don't have that diversity, you will be at a disadvantage. And so NCWIT is primarily a National Science Foundation funded organization that's data driven. So forget that it might feel good. We all have daughters or know young women or women. Isn't it great? It's just good business. And so let's start with that premise, and then diversity becomes part of the cornerstone of your culture and very much part of your strategy. I'm a big believer that business strategy is far more about talent strategy today than it ever has been before. And so this is sort of a core area. So as part of what we do at ViaWest, clearly we drive a ton of thought around it, but I've run, as an example, I've run my management teams through unconscious bias, because men and women have an equal propensity to bias. And once we start to raise it up and talk about it and present it, it's amazing how many of the small things that can change, all the way to the way you set up your agendas, how you meet in your companies, how you can think about your recruitment strategies. It should be a little bit less about the percentages, because I think that's an easy place to go. It's not a bad metric, but it should be part about how am I thinking about the diversity of my workforce so that I can actually achieve my objectives and outperform my competition. So these are areas that it just has to be part of how we sort of get up every morning and think about how am I going to make my company operate better than the next guy. This has to be a cornerstone or we will ultimately fail. I would argue many countries are better at this than the US. And so if there was sort of a challenge here, we should look outward to say, what are other countries doing in their strategies in businesses to create a competitive advantage? One of the key factors is going to be drawing talent into the US, and that's going to be, we've got to open the doors, we've got to open the border, we have to make it easier for visas, we have to attract not only STEM, but into the compute science fields, computational areas. All of those are critical. AI. This is what the future's about, and if we don't actively promote and present and compete, other countries will do it, and they have the propensity to outperform us. So that's the thing that probably, if I was to say, what do we need to be doing differently? We've really got to be looking at how do we recruit the very best talent globally into our organizations, because we have a ton of advantages to do that.
So start thinking about your questions for this awesome panel. We're going to ask a couple more questions up here, but get your ideas ready for Andrew, Bruce, and Nancy. I would ask the next question to the panel. We talked about talent, and we talked about what you're doing internally. If you rewound the clock on Zayo or ViaWest or Liberty, and it was that first construct of going global, what were some of the best practices or some of the processes that you set up, and what would you recommend as those best practices when you're thinking about first stepping outside the US and doing business in another country?
Sonia? So I wasn't actually at Zayo, and I was on the receiving end of the pace of what they went at when I was running EMEA for level 3 communications. And what I admired from a distance about Zayo was the pace at which they moved at acquiring assets to really augment their fiber facilities across Europe. Meanwhile, my other employer was spent too much time through working its way through red tape of the business case and could we support the valuation, et cetera, and candidly, Zayo beat us to the punch. And once we'd woken up, most of the available, alternate assets to the incumbents had been gobbled up. The other one as well, which I know was not by former employee, but another competitor out there, lost on a bid for a long-haul bit of asset that Zayo acquired, Viatel, across Europe. So if you get the in-country assets, you need to connect them together with the long haul to make sure you can get that connectivity equation end-to-end for your customer. Well, Zayo's purchase price for that could not be understood whatsoever by some of the competing chief executives. And that was because of the strategic valuation that Zayo put on that and moved beyond, what would be regular valuation to get the asset. And boy, when you fast forward 3 years, you look at the pace and the aggressiveness that the company went at, leaves us with a prime set of assets that candidly ain't available anymore there. So pace and conviction and real clarity about which part of the market did you want to win and how you were going to take it. And that really allowed them to stand out and capture a whole series of assets in a region out of home territory in short order.
Bruce?
Yeah, I think I agree completely with you, Andrew. I mean, Liberty Global is a company that was built, like many John Malone companies, around M&A. And I think at the high level, you need a clear strategy. We decided we were only going to go after the number 1 or 2 cable operators in a country. If they were below number 2, we were going to move on and explore other areas. We also looked for contiguous borders across our acquisitions, which made it easier for us to create a pan-European footprint and interconnect our networks and begin to manage the extraordinarily challenging process of consolidating these acquisitions in a rapid-fire pace under one back-office system. One thing I will also say that we did well was that sort of integration consolidation, the Tiger teams that went out and managed through that process, making quick decisions, and in most cases the right decisions around who stays and who goes, really focusing on integrating them into the Liberty Global culture, which we think is really special. And to add on to Nancy's point, the diversity is absolutely important, but you can't attract talent unless you really treat your people extraordinarily well. And there's lots of ways to do that, and a lot of it has to do with how the culture develops in the company, how the culture is communicated across which platforms it's communicated. Obviously we're in Europe heavily, and benefits are very different over there than they are here, and all of those things I think contribute to building a great company.
I think we did a ton of acquisition ourselves as we continued to grow the company over the last decade, and the one thing I've learned is it's actually not that different. I mean, we approach things from a regional perspective, and every community that we went into was a little bit different. There was a ton that was common, but there were always nuances. And when you understand the communities you're in and their buying habits and sort of need to the development of the ecosystem that are different in every situation, I think it prepared us very well to go into new countries. So I think that was a really important, we sort of got our mojo in terms of our ability to do this and integrate culturally as we went through acquisitions, and we were able to do them very quickly because we started to build sort of a sense of knowing the communities and understanding what was going to be the ins and outs. I was struck by, I worked with a company many years ago. They were extraordinarily well known. I won't mention who it is, but they were sort of a world leader in packaged foods, and they decided they were going to go into Japan. And they said, well, gee, every house has a rice cooker in it. Why won't our cake mixes work really well? Clearly we'll make this cake mix that you can put it in the rice cooker and everybody will buy it because that appliance sits in every home. Well, boy, did they ever miss it, because rice is sort of a sacred thing in Japanese culture. And to think that you would put anything in your rice cooker other than rice was atrocious. So you got to know, you've got to know what you're doing, what you're going in, how you're approaching things, and they're all a little bit different. And so there isn't a sort of a cookie cutter. There's elements of that, but really know the communities that you're entering and be confident about, where your buyers are. So I think that's been an important part for us.
Thanks, Nancy. Well, I'd love to open it up for the next 10 minutes for some questions for the group. You raise your hand. I think I'll have a mic kind of wandering around to okay, there's a couple of them. Here they come. Up front.
Do I get the first question? So I'm wildly impressed with this idea of diversity and talent and going to war for talent and disrupting yourself. So if you were advising a student like University of Denver, for instance, what do they need to study? What do they need to study? And it seems like the old days was kind of study finance and marketing, but do you need students to study creativity and art? Because in the global environment, how do you get to innovation? Is it studying more marketing or studying art?
Do you?
Bruce
I'm just
and I
going to give
wanna-
you my opinion, which is worth what it is, right? Because this is going to vary a lot from one managing person to another. But I love kids who have a creative background. I love kids who can write well. Obviously the sort of the quant side of the business. There's always going to be a need there, the marketing side. But when you start talking about diversity, I don't think, and I don't want to presume, Nancy, but I don't think you were talking about gender or race. I think you were talking about the diversity of background and diversity of education. So I'm a big fan of it.
I think it's all of the above, gender, race, certainly diversity of backgrounds. The worst thing that we do is we completely gravitate to our own attributes because we go, well, that made me successful, so I want 10 more of these. The reality is it needs to be obviously a very, what I like about the cross-functional approach is that it does bring different backgrounds, and I think that the most appealing, innovative groups are people that come from various. I guarantee you, if you look at the three of us, we all came up through different backgrounds, approaches. I took a far different path than many others, and yet that put a fingerprint on my organization and approach. So, what I would say is we have a massive pipeline problem in the compute science, whether it's taking a look at are we going to be prepared for AI, IoT, all of these areas. And if we don't drive more women into the compute science fields, we are going to fail as a country. The data's there, it's half the population. If we don't figure out how to make it a more engaging, supportive, and that it's not only getting them into undergraduate and graduate programs, it's then sustaining in the businesses that they join, and that they feel like they're in the positions that will allow them to grow and thrive. That's just an essential piece, because if we don't get that right, we have a massive pipeline issue that will catch up to us. It already is. So,
my perspective is at some point, whether it's at the MBA level or at the early degree level, a rounded business studies degree that gives people a broad experience across all of the functions under the corporate hood, I think is really good grounding to set people off on the entrepreneurial track, innovation track, because ultimately all that needs to be thought through and threaded together. If there's areas of specialism, might be a little biased, but having some kind of global remit to it, technology remit, and here's one that I get blown away by my kids, is linguistic too, some language skill. And never ceases to amaze me that how ignorant I feel when I traverse the world and all the meetings are conducted in English. And there's a few countries where I can get by in a few paragraphs, and when I do that, it goes a heck of a long way with either your customers, with your suppliers, and your employees. So I think having that linguistic opportunity will give you all sorts of insight into different cultures and stand you well while you're traversing the globe.
Well, and I appreciate what the University of Denver and others are doing in terms of starting to bring these cross-functional, whether it's MBA, legal, and compute science. I think those are really starting to round young people into better prepared to come into sort of this digital economy.
I'll give you a good example. Micah, raise your hand. Micah Gerard Levin started as an intern with us, music and sociology major, hell of a pianist, by the way. He didn't know shit about finance, capital markets, anything quantitative, and he's now a senior analyst, manager. He worked his way up. I would put him up against any MBA grad in terms of his quant understanding, but he also brings a lot of other thinking to the table based on your creative background. So I think that's a great background.
I had a
Well,
Next question.
I'm an
Yeah.
economics grad, so I don't know what the hell I'm running a tech company, but there you go.
I had a very similar question, but maybe we can take a different vein in answering it. I don't know if you knew or not, but there's several bright high school students, a very diverse group that are looking to get into this world, if you will. And I know you're past to me the startup phase of your businesses, obviously. But could you give them some advice, stepping all the way back into the high school realms of where you're acting as if you were a high school student now? What exactly would you be doing? I know the linguistics, I think that's a great idea. Stuff similar to that they can really be working on to make themselves more valuable in the workplace, as they hear over and over that there's a lack of valuable folks in the workplace.
One thing I throw out is travel. Go see the world a little bit. Expose yourself to other cultures and people and ways. I think it was served me well, and if I was giving advice to high school kids that after high school or after university, go take the time and see, because it's some of the best lessons I had that I think set myself up very well. So I'd say go travel, see the world.
Play a team sport. Yeah, I respect, and I play some individual sports myself, golf as an example, but I played team sport quite heavily through college and school. It was soccer, and boy, teaches you how everybody's got to come together to win, and individuals really don't matter. And when you take that mentality and exposure into the workplace, it's a great formula.
I would only add, the world is moving to software. You look at blockchain, you look at robotics, you look at AI. These are hugely disruptive categories, and if you don't start thinking about how you're going to interact and engage with robots from either a manufacturing, a development, or some other form of business, there's a reasonably good chance that your job's going to get disrupted. And that's all going to take place here in the next 20 or 30 years.
Next question.
So my question is, since the entire panel has been based around innovation, is with everyone trying to say what's practical for ideas and everything, how would you tap into your more creative side and sort of actionable steps that can be taken to act on that creativity to create innovation in startups?
So the question is, how can you expand or kind of build up that muscle on your creative side? Like a little bit of a addition of the previous question, but what do you recommend to really bring out that creative flavor?
You stumped us. Is that it? I don't know. It's an interesting question. I don't know how you develop intellectual curiosity, but I've always been kind of a what-if person. As you see problems, and how do you think about solving them? And so, I think that's just an area. And as I'm recruiting, that's sort of an essential for me, that you have this natural curiosity, or you've developed it. To not just sort of live in today, but what if we try this, or what if we do this, or constantly kind of pushing versus just sort of staying in the moment. I think that's easy for companies to sort of get into that tunnel vision of, hey, this is working, but to constantly be pushing yourself, because you could become legends in your own mind, and something's going to come and disrupt you tomorrow. So I think it's the what if and the constant sort of curiosity of what's around the corner.
couple of pieces of advice. Baby steps fast. So keep innovating, small chunks. I think we said agile before, that model, so just keep building on it. Clearly, you can celebrate the successes along the way, which builds momentum, but also think hard about the failures. There's a lot of learnings within them that'll protect you for the future, and failing's a good thing. It's fine. You progress with failure. Getting comfortable with that's okay. Repeating the same mistakes twice gets a little old, but learning from different mistakes, it's got to be encouraged, and don't sweep it under the mat and hide. Get it all exposed, because there's vital learnings in there, which mean the next innovation leap will be better probability of success. So that would be my practical advice.
And I would add, the best way to become a successful entrepreneur is to go work for a large corporation before you decide to go out on your own. Right? Because there's value in understanding a process-driven, cross-functional, multi-influencer organization. It's not unlike playing team sports, but on a much broader scale. You'll be a much more successful entrepreneur.
Final question up here in front.
Oh, we got to get.
Okay.
I can stand up and talk. Everybody hear me?
Rock and roll.
So I'm interested in your opinions. What I'm seeing right now in the market globally is kind of a connected consume technology that's coming out, meaning you're connecting inside your cloud or inside your data center. And then the second piece of that is the performance to the end user out there, whether that be a customer or an employee. Are you seeing that type of change? Are you seeing that kind of build out happen around the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything's getting pushed to the edge. I think the advent of 5G, as we think of mobility and the movement there, fondly called the fog, I guess, in terms of compute, getting closer to the consumer. And I think that's based on a multitude of things: latency and the size of data and the amount of data. So, our strategy is one where, when I say 40 data centers, it's because we continue to push further out from both tier 1 into tier 2, tier 3. Just a constant pushing further and closer to the edge. So yes, I'd say that's in full work, and it's on everybody's radar right now.
And not missing the performance piece as well, out to the end user. The public cloud versus the private cloud. Whichever path people go down, that performance factor is becoming increasingly important. Many applications are highly sensitive to that. Together with diversity, triversity, if you've got critical business functions out there that are driving your business, the lifeblood of the organization, the performance, and when there's an issue, you got to have another alternate route to keep the company alive. So all of the above of what you said, we're feeling, and our customers are pushing us that way too.
Yeah, I think innovation in general, one great way to approach it is to be very consumer driven. The consumers will help lead you in the direction that you as a business need to go. I think in general, that's a great approach to driving more innovation.
Just one other thing I'd say is, in my view, local is kind of the new global. I mean, I really do believe, from what used to be long-haul capabilities and traversing data, it's really starting to become much more compact in the communities, and we see innovation occurring in the communities. When we talk about global, it always sounds, but I really do believe we're moving to much more of a community-based consumption, and therefore that's really where they could emerge anywhere, right?
Awesome. This has been an absolute wonderful discussion, and they'll probably stick around here for a few minutes to answer any additional questions. Again, thank you again to our title sponsors, Aging 2.0, Comcast, Chase for Business, Downtown Denver Partnership, and WeWork. And we're going to do a two-stage wrap-up here to these awesome leaders and innovators. The first is a round of applause for the panel. And the second part of the wrap up is a standing ovation for Zayo's, ViaWest, and Liberty's commitment to the Denver community and your leadership within NC-WIT, things like the University of Denver and Startup Colorado and Blackstone. You guys are amazing leaders doing not only great work in your companies, but in the community, and a standing ovation for that.
And one quick announcement before you all go. There's a great panel happening inside at 3 o'clock. The GM of We Work for the West will be talking about culture, and there's also donuts and both alcoholic and non-alcoholic beverages because it's Startup Week. So head on inside. And if you're under 21, you can't have alcohol.